Hello friends, welcome to Tarunais. Today we will be discussing editorials from the Hindu of 3rd of November 2022. So let's start with the editorial. So the topic of the today's editorial is about the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Russia-Ukraine war. The writer basically compares the two events and he gives a description of the dissimilarities between the events and the similarities between the events. You can relate this topic with your General Studies paper 1, that is World History Events since 18th century onwards. The source of this article has been taken from the Hindu. So this is the article, the most dangerous moment since 1962. The October 1962 is also known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. Cuban Missile Crisis, post failed invasion of Bay of Pigs. Bay of Pigs. This is a small bay near the Cuban island. Cuban island. So let's discuss the points, the viewpoints of the writer, and we will see a brief of Cuban Missile Crisis and Bay of Pig invasion and what the writer wants to say when it comes to comparing the two different ideologies and also about the hegemony that US had for a very long time, and now it has been challenged by China and by Russia also. Although Russia is not being considered as a very big player, and as we discussed the national security strategy of the Biden's administration, then the Biden's administration does not consider Russia as a very big challenge to the US administration. However, the strategy did describe China as a big challenge. Since February 2022, when the war started, it has been almost 9 months. So the war has prolonged for almost 9 months, and the writer says that it could escalate into the Russia-NATO war if it is not averted on time. The writer says that the President Kennedy and the Khrushchev of the leader of the Soviet Union of that time, because the USSR disintegrated in the year 1990s onwards, there was a disintegration of the Soviet Union, and the countries, they separated from the Soviet, and they started to assert their own sovereignty and independent status. So let's see what the writer has to say. So this is the map of the world. You can look at, this is the location of the United States of America, and this is the Caribbean Sea, where the Cuba is located near the state of Florida. Near the state of Florida of United States of America, and this is where the Russia is. So Russia basically, now what happened during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and what is this Cuban Missile Crisis? Due to the unsettling political and ideological differences, there was a kind of a Cold War that escalated between Russia and USA post World War II. We know that the USA regime started to follow the capitalist economy, and Russia was more inclined toward the communist regime. However, the Cuba, under the leadership of the Fidel Castro and other communists, they wanted to have Cuba as a communist regime. However, the USA considers this as threat to its hegemony, because USA wanted to spread capitalist economy to the world, and the same thing happened in the Vietnam also, because Vietnam also saw for a very brief period, not exactly for a brief period, but for a considerable time, it did see the communist regime, and which escalated into the USA-Vietnam War. Similar thing happened before USA-Vietnam War. Cuba was also converting into the communist regime, and USA considered it as a challenge to its hegemony, having a neighboring country convert into the communist regime under the influence of, and also being aided by and influenced by the USSR, that is Russia, and then that time it was USSR. So therefore, USA in April 1962 invaded an island which is known as near the Bay of Pigs. This is a place which was actually a kind of a hiding place for the Fidel Castro and the other communist leader who wanted to have Cuba as a communist country. Therefore, however, the Bay of Pigs, it failed. And then later on it escalated into the Cuban Missile Crisis, because Russia which considered the invasion of the Bay of Pigs as threat to its influence. It had deployed missiles around this island. It deployed missiles around the Cuban island, which then escalated into the Cuban Missile Crisis. However, the two leaders did avert the war, and they prevented what could have been another war. So this was the Cuban Missile Crisis, which happened due to the ideological differences, and two blocs were formed post World War II. Two blocs were formed. One was the NATO bloc and the Communist or Soviet bloc. USA was worried that Soviet would invade Cuba, and they would establish what would be a communist regime. Right. So you can look at here. So this is the island of Cuba near the state of Florida of USA. So this is USA naval blockade because considering it as a threat, the USA had imposed naval blockade. What does this naval blockade means? That USA would deploy its marine ships around Cuba so as to prevent any movement from the country, and from the country to the outside world, and from outside world to the country. And this is the location of the Soviet missiles. Now if we look at the range of the Soviet missile, then it would cover almost half of the United States of America. The USSR said that this was for the defensive purpose. This was for the defensive purpose. So there were intermediate range ballistic missiles and there were medium range ballistic missiles. So this is about the Bay of Pig invasion which happened in the April 1962. This happened in April 1962. Basically, the ultimate goal was to overthrow of Castro and establishment of a non-communist government friendly to United States. So what they wanted to do, what the US wanted to do, is to establish a non-communist government which would be friendly to the policy of the USA, and they would allow to use Cuba as their base. So this is where the Bay of Pigs is located. This is the island of Cuba. This is the capital Havana, and this is Caribbean Sea. This is the Atlantic Ocean. This is Gulf of Mexico. This is Miami, and this is the United States of America, the state of Florida. Near the state of Florida it is located, and this is where the Bay of Pigs is located, which basically worked as the hiding place of Fidel Castro. So this is some old picture. Now what happens? Now what is the recent context according to the writer? The writer talks about the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war, and it has been 9 months since the Russia-Ukraine war started. And there is a lot of devastation, and Russia has been accused of the human right violation. Russia has also been accused of human right violation. So what happens, what is the origin of the crisis according to the writer? Now what happened during the Cold War also, since two blocs were formed, so some of the countries, they were going with the USA and some countries were going with Russia or the then Soviet Union. But what happened? Post disintegration of the Soviet Union, Russia considered, or Moscow considered it as challenge to its administration or challenge to its influence or regime. However, the then presidents of United States of America said that the countries who have declared their independence or sovereignty from Russia, they have their independent right to be associated with any of the organizations. The writer wants to say that when the same thing is applied to Cuba, then we can accuse USA of infiltration into Cuba or illegal invasion into Cuba. Now what happens? Cuba was also a sovereign country. It also had the independent right to declare itself as either a communist country or a capitalist country. It could either be influenced by Russia or not be influenced by Russia. So why USA of that time, why the Kennedy regime was so worried about Cuba being turned into a communist regime? And when the same thing is applied to Russia, then the USA consider it as threat to the international law and order, or threat to breaking the law, breaking the international norms by the USA. However, the writer says that two leaders, that is the Kennedy, the then Prime President of the United States of America, and Khrushchev, who was the then Soviet leader, they averted this Cold War into a proper war. The Cold War into a proper war was averted. So there is according to the writer, there is a fear of escalation of the conflict as Russia-NATO war. There are similarities and dissimilarities which we would see between the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Ukraine war. So what happened? The Khrushchev, who was the then Soviet leader, he moved the nuclear missiles. That means the Cold War was averted, and the two leaders prevented the escalation of the Cold War into the nuclear war. So the nuclear missiles to Cuba after the CIA, which is the Central Intelligence Agency of United States of America, backed the Bay of Pigs invasion of the island in 1961, where the guerrillas under the command of the Fidel Castro and Che Guevara, they had overthrown a pro-American military dictatorship in the year 1959. So if we look at the map of Ukraine, this is the capital Kyiv, and these are some of the places which the Russia have recently invaded, and Russia has also moved towards the Kyiv capital and had invaded the Ukraine capital as well. And the Crimea Peninsula was invaded by the Russia in the year 2014. So there are various arguments given by the Russia. The first argument is the eastward shift of NATO. So Russia considered NATO as threat. According to the arguments given by the President Putin, President Putin says that ever since the end of the Cold War, these two blocs were formed after the Cold War, after the World War II, during the Cold War, and since the Cold War has ended, why is there a need for NATO to exist? Why not USA abolish this organization altogether? And why the USA is promoting this organization or not halting the newer membership? So Ukraine was also interested in having the membership of the NATO. Turkey also has membership of NATO. So Russia considered NATO as threat to its regime, and the argument of Putin is also valid when it comes to seeing the recent events from the perspective of the end of Cold War. So this is the first argument. The second argument that Mr. Putin has given is about Ukraine working as a hide shift for the people who are working against Russia, against the Russian regime. So these are the two important or the major arguments that Mr. Putin has given with respect to when he justifies his invasion of Ukraine. So coming back to the Cuban Missile Crisis and looking at the similarities, then the Soviets claimed that the missiles are for the defensive purpose when they deployed the nuclear missiles near Cuba. The USA did not accept this challenge, and they would not have accepted any challenge to their hegemony in the Western sphere, especially in the immediate periphery, and because considering the strategic location of the Cuban island, which is near to the USA state of Florida, then USA definitely couldn't have accepted this challenge to its hegemony. The origin of the Ukraine crisis can also be traced to the NATO's eastward expansion. They also argued that the former Soviet allies and the newly born republic, according to the Kennedy's administration, the Soviet allies and the newly independent republics, that means who were formed after the disintegration of the USSR, they were independent entities, and they could take sovereign decisions on whether they should join any military alliance or not. However, this was the argument given by the Kennedy's administration, and his national security team did not accept the argument given by the USSR that the Cuban missiles were for the defensive purpose, and the Cuba was also an independent country which could take sovereign decisions whether it should host Soviet missiles or not. So Russian President Vladimir Putin and his team did not buy NATO's similar arguments. So this is about the similarity of the two events. The similarity of the two events. So Mr. Putin sees NATO's expansion into and growing influence on the old Russian dreamland as a national security threat to Russia, just like Kennedy administration saw the presence of Soviet missiles in the Caribbean as a national security threat to the United States of America. So how did the Cuban Missile ended? The Cuban Missile Crisis was ended because there was a kind of a resolution or an agreement between the two leaders, that is the Khrushchev, the Soviet leader of that time, and Kennedy, President Kennedy of United States of America, and they made a diplomatic effort to end the Cold War. So the writer says that Mr. Putin and USA President Joe Biden, they have missed the bus to avert an actual conflict, but they can still avert a catastrophic direct Russia-NATO war, but they are not doing anything to meet that. This is what the writer wants to say, that just like Kennedy and Khrushchev had averted a nuclear war by averting or by resolving the Cuban Missile Crisis or the Cold War, Mr. Putin and US President Joe Biden have not been putting enough efforts to avert any escalation. They are not putting enough efforts to alleviate each other's fear and end the Russia-Ukraine war. Rather, USA is providing arms to Ukraine against Russia. What is the spiral model? The writer discusses a spiral model in the context of the international war and international diplomacy. The writer says that the current Russia-Ukraine war is a textbook example of the spiral model, what international theorists called as a spiral model. Now what happens in this spiral model? The two leaders, the two hostile parties, they match each other in terms of hostility and escalating the existing conflict. Like if USA is expanding NATO, then Russia would also try its level best to expand its influence in the neighboring countries, especially the neighboring countries, and they would also try to influence the other countries in their favor. For example, when it comes to Israel gets support from USA, and when it comes to Iran does get support from Russia. So it's a kind of a bloc which still continues. There is a bloc led by Russia, although the influence of Russia has declined post its disintegration and the economy and the downward economy that it currently has, especially after the sanctions posed by USA post Russia-Ukraine war. So Russia is considered as aggressor in this case, who has violated the international laws and norms by annexing the Ukraine and its territories. However, this is according to the writer, this normative absolutism is not consistent with the past and present of America foreign policy. Now, when we consider the American foreign policy, then America has always followed a foreign policy which fulfills its interest. Whether we look at the position of Israel, whether we look at the Vietnam, whether we look at Iran, West Asia, Afghanistan. So wherever USA saw its interest being fulfilled, it invaded that country or basically tried to influence that region. However, the same thing cannot be argued for Russia. The USA itself, according to the writer, the USA itself has violated many of the United Nations norms, and it independently and unilaterally imposes sanctions on the country. It did not recognize that its ally Israel has also annexed Syria's Golan Heights. It does not recognize the dispute of Jerusalem, and in fact recently during the Trump administration, Jerusalem was recognized as the capital of Israel. Now Jerusalem, because it is a conflicted territory between Palestine and Israel has located its embassy to Tel Aviv. to Tel Aviv, and it does not have its embassy at Jerusalem, although Israel does claim Jerusalem as its capital. So, but we are not going to go into the detail of Israel and Palestine conflict. That probably we will see in some other editorial. But as for now, the writer wants to say that the USA has also violated many of the United Nations norms, and there is no consistency between what USA does and what USA preaches. So the writer is of the opinion that the two leaders, that means Mr. Putin and Mr. Joe Biden, they both have to put effort in order to elevate the fears of each other. That means they have to sympathize, they have to have a strategic sympathy with each other. Now, what does this strategic empathy means? That means the two rival parties, they empathize with each other regardless of the moral position that the two rival parties take. Now, whenever there is a war, the two parties, they always take a moral position. Now, Russia's moral position is about that the eastward migration of the NATO is like threat to its regime, and USA position is that Russia has violated the international norms and it has violated the democratic right of a sovereign country. So these are the two different moral positions that have been taken by the rival leaders. However, according to the strategic empathy, means that the two rival leaders need to understand the fears of each other, and they have to come to a conclusion, or they have to what in international national parlance is known as the rapprochement. So they have to reproach and they have to resolve this conflict. So this is what the writer says, and the writer gives a similarity that just like the Kennedy administration and the Khrushchev, the then Soviet leader, had the strategic empathy with each other, and that's why they were able to resolve the Cuban Missile Crisis. They were able to end the Cold War, and which could have been escalated into a full nuclear war. So that's it for today. Thank you so much for watching Tarun Eyes. Have a nice day.